This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com. This episode of SketchUp a 3D Toolbox is brought to you by 3D Connection, makers of the Space Navigator. To learn more about the best way to navigate in SketchUp, visit 3dconnection.com. Hey there everyone, and welcome to another episode of SketchUp, a 3D Toolbox. I'm Cameron Harris, and this is episode number 56. Now today, we're going to be wrapping up our series on the Kaweah Falls house. Remember, this is the house that we've been modeling these past few episodes. It stretches over a river. It is absolutely gorgeous, and today we're going to be finishing that project by texturing it, and then we're going to be doing something pretty cool with a piece of software that I've been using for the past few weeks called Shaderlight. Shaderlight is a photorealistic renderer for SketchUp. So you can take your SketchUp models and render them in such a way that they look almost like photos. It's a really cool plugin, and it's very easy to use despite how powerful it is. So let's dive right into it. So to start off with, this is our project as we left it at the end of the last episode. Remember, we did all the roofing on this, which was fairly complicated, but the end result was really, really good. So we've got all of our roofing, we've got our windows, our doors, the basic structure of our house. Now all that's left to do is texture it and add a few little details that are pretty easy to do, and then we can render it out. So first thing we want to do, of course, we'll notice if we look at the model as it is right now, we have the floor plan that we've been basing this model off of the entire time. This is a fantastic modeling tool. However, when it comes to making realistic renders of a model, you don't want to have the floor plan being underneath it. You want an actual ground cover. So we're going to go ahead and delete that because we don't need it anymore. You can see right now our model is just kind of floating in space. So this is just fine. Now we're going to start texturing this guy. Now we've talked about texturing models before, quite a bit actually, and in the past we've almost always used SketchUp's built-in texture tool. So let's go ahead and use that right now. We'll switch that using the B key, that's for the bucket tool, and we get our colors palette. Now we can choose, of course, regular colors, just straight ahead colors from the crayon box, or we can click on this little brick icon here, bring up the texture palette, and choose from all kinds of different textures. So for right now, let's start with the tops of the roof. So if we go here, we can see there is a category in here called roofing. If we click on that, here are the various roofing textures that we have available to us. So we can start applying these to our model. So let's see here. Let's go with something like, what's this texture look like? I'll choose this just by clicking on it, and then I'll click on one of my roof sections. That's pretty good. Let's try another one. Oh, that looks pretty good. That's very nice. But you see, when I apply it, it applies it to everything, not just the top of the texture, or not just the top of the roof, but it applies it underneath and on the sides. We don't want that. And the reason it's doing that is because it's a grouped roof section. And when you apply a texture to a group, it applies the texture to every surface on that group. So we don't want that. I'm going to undo that real quick. And I'm going to double click on the group to go into it until I can select each face individually. That means I can texture each face individually. I'll select my roofing pattern here and just apply it to the top. There we go. Now, I'm going to do the same thing for my other roof sections. You can see sometimes I'm going to need to drill down a couple layers deep. There we go. Go to the other one. Now, of course, when we're texturing a model, we always want to look at the photos of the actual house that we're modeling so we can make sure we're being as accurate as we possibly can. And if we look at this photo, we can see that the edges of the roof are a sort of a darkish green, not a really bright green, but sort of a dull, dusty green. And we're going to go ahead and apply that color. So that's just a straight ahead color. We don't need to use a fancy texture for that. So for that, I've actually gotten that loaded up right here. It's this color right here, sort of a yellowish, greenish color. It's a little bit darker. And if I go ahead and choose that and start applying that to my group, I can go into the group, and then I can start applying that texture to the edges. You can see that is looking really good. Now, I could go ahead and just click on every single face, or if I undo that, the rest of these faces are all white. and I want them all to be this sort of pea green color instead. So what I can do for that is I can hold down the Option key or the Alt key if you're on a PC, and then click on one of the white faces. And when I do that, you can see it applies it to every face that is that color. So holding down the Option key will texture every color that's the same color as the face you're selecting. It will color every face in that group that is that same texture with whatever texture you're replacing. So really nice way to be very quick about it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to the rest of my roof sections. There we go. So we've got all of the roof sections textured now. And of course, the biggest part of the house that you're going to see from the outside at least is the siding. And the siding, if we take a look at that in the photo, we can see that it's this sort of these large panels, these vertical slats that are attached to the side of the house that are in a similar color as the strips of the roof that we've just been working on. Now for that, we're not going to be able to use a texture that's built into SketchUp because SketchUp can only have so many textures. It's not a texture library, it's a modeling program. So we're going to have to use our own texture. And as it happens, I have one that I've put together for this very occasion called Kaweah Falls siding. So this is pretty darn close. I've messed around with the color of this a little bit and made it so it's tileable and everything. So it'll repeat when it tiles itself across the side of the house. It'll be seamless. So we're going to go ahead and use this. Now, don't worry about creating this yourself. You can if you want to, but you can also go to our website, harvardpodcast.com, and I'll have the texture available for download along with this lesson file for this episode as well. So we've got that. I'm going to go ahead and import it into SketchUp. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the group. I'm going to start with this wall right here. This is a nice big wall, good example of the texture. With it selected, I'm going to go ahead and go to the File menu and choose Import. And I'm going to go into the Textures folder on my desktop and choose Kaweah Falls siding.png. Format is all supported image types. That's perfect. This is the important one. Use as texture is what we want. Use as image, that'll just import the image as its own physical object, like a billboard almost. And use as new matched photo is a very complicated modeling technique that we're not getting into today. So I'm going to just use as texture and hit import. And the instant I do that, I now have this image attached to my bucket tool. And you can see it's huge. Well, we don't want that, but don't worry, this is just a preview, just to show you what it is you're going to be painting. I'm going to go down to this corner right here and snap it to the endpoint, and then I click once, and then I can scale it up and down as much as I want. No need to be too precise about this. This is purely visual, purely aesthetic. So I'm just going to, let's set it for maybe 3 feet. That looks about right. And once I click again, you can see that it's tiled that across. So that same image, that one image has been tiled across this whole wall, and it's looking great. So that's fantastic. I can now just go back in. I want to apply it to the rest of the exterior parts of this house. I can't use the trick where I hold down the Option key or the Alt key because all of the interior parts of the wall are white as well. So I would texture the whole thing with this siding. Don't want that. So I'm just going to go ahead and sample this texture by holding down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC. And when I do that, I get the eyedropper, so I can load that texture into my colors palette, and then I can just apply it to everything like this. And we're just going to apply it to all of the exterior walls right now. All right, so now that we've gotten that siding texture applied, if we look at our model now and move this out of the way, this is looking really, really good. You're really starting to see the house come through. But one thing that is still lacking is color when we look through these windows. The interior walls are still all white. Now, we're not going to get into modeling the interior because there's so much furniture and so many little details. We'd be here forever doing that. But we can texture the inside of the house just so that when we're looking through these windows, we'll see some color. We'll see something that's pretty close to what would actually be there. And for that, I'm going to use a slightly different color. There's this color right here, which is a bit of a lighter color, sort of an off-white taupe color. And I'm going to color all the interior walls with that texture. So I can go ahead and apply that to all of these walls in here. You can see it's subtle. It's not a very bright and bold color, but it doesn't need to be. You know, it's just a little colorful wash for the inside. So I'll go ahead and apply it to all of the interior walls. There we go. That's looking really good. So now when we look through these windows, we don't just see pure white. We see some color, which is excellent. And then the other thing I'm going to do is the other big faces that we see when we look on the exterior of the house. We've got these sections right here, these porches. This one right here, and this one right here. At the moment, those are still pure white. That doesn't look very good, so we're going to go ahead and apply some more textures to that. I'm going to go back into SketchUp's built-in texture palette. I'm going to go to the brick and cladding area. And this texture right here, sort of a nice sort of simple stone texture. That's really good. So I'm going to go ahead and select this top face of my porch right here. I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'll apply it again up here. There we go. And then, of course, the other main thing we need to do on the inside, speaking of flooring, is we need to do some flooring. So for that, I'm going to go into the wood section of my textures palette, and I'm going to choose the appropriate flooring from here. So for example, in the master bedroom area of the house, if I go into this room right here, we're actually using two types of flooring in here. One of them is a light wood on this lower level here, so I'm going to choose this texture and apply it. That looks good. Now, if your textures go in at a weird angle like this, that means that your axis tool isn't set up correctly. So I'm going to undo that. I'm just going to choose the axis tool. I'm going to real quick set up my axis in here, apply that texture again. And then the other texture that we're going to use is up on the top level here. And that's actually carpeted, so I'm going to choose the carpet and textiles section. I'll just go with a simple color like that. That looks really good. So that's working really well for us. The rest of the house, however, if we look at a photo, it uses these really beautiful dark slate tiles. And that's a texture that just does not exist in SketchUp at all. So we need to, again, make that. And I've gone ahead and created a slate texture for us, which is right here. This is the slate texture right here, and this is, again, completely tileable and will also be available on our website for you to download and use yourself if you don't want to bother with making your own. So I'm going to go back into SketchUp and I'm going to go ahead and navigate in. You want to make sure that when you're doing this import photo to use as a texture thing, you want to make sure that you can instantly apply it. So make sure you're in the group that you want to be in and make sure you're all ready for it. And then we'll go import, and I'll choose my Kaweah Falls stone floor texture. Use as texture, perfect. Import it, and now, again, it comes in huge. We're going to just select one, and then we're just going to scale this so that, these are fairly large tiles, so I'm going to choose maybe 2 feet. There we go. And you can see once I did that, it stretched it out, covered all the floor. This is looking really good. Now at this point, I'm going to jump ahead slightly in the modeling process because I'm sure you guys don't want to see me model every little detail because we've talked about a lot of these modeling techniques in the past and you guys know how to do this stuff by now. So I'm going to show you the final version of the house that I did. And I've added some extra details to it and I've done a little bit more texture work, but this is all something that's very easy to do on your own. So this is the house as it is right now in my model. So you can see what I've done is, again, I've just kept all the textures as we just did them. I've done a little bit of extra detail. For example, this front room here actually has wood paneling on the interior of the room. And I've just added some extra details. The railings, for example, the railings are just simple posts with a little topper and then just some very simple little rectangles extruded out like this, very thin to kind of look like wire. And then, of course, we've got the bridge, and the bridge is the same thing. It's just a rectangle with the posts and the wires on the side. Very simple. And then this is just, obviously, the whole house doesn't look like this, but to really model the entire house, you need to model all of the terrain around it, which is pretty difficult to do unless you have a survey team with you. So I just modeled what I could. And then this is just a big sheet of actually a grid. We talked about this when we were talking about the landscaping tools in SketchUp. These are part of the sandbox tools. This is a grid that I stretched out and then used the smooth tool. You can go back to a previous episode on landscaping to see how that works. And I just kind of slanted the whole thing down to look like water flow and then textured it to look like water, obviously. So we've gotten all of this done. This is what our house looks like now. Now we can use Shaderlight to create a really beautiful looking render of this. Now, before we start working in Shaderlight, I want to take a minute to talk about one of my favorite tools when it comes to SketchUp, the Space Navigator. I've gotten loads of messages from people asking how I move through my SketchUp models so smoothly and quickly. I'd love to say it's experience or skill, but actually it's all because of this beauty right here. Think of the Space Navigator as a joystick for SketchUp. Just grab onto the top part and move or twist it in the direction you want to move. Compare it to a keyboard and mouse, and you'll realize how smooth, fast, and accurate you can be with a Space Navigator. Check it out at 3dconnection.com, and I want to thank them so much for sponsoring this episode of SketchUp, a 3D Toolbox. Now, back to Shaderlight. So Shaderlight is a fantastic, really powerful tool that's very easy to use to create these really gorgeous 3D model renders. So you can get it from this website right here. You can download a trial version that's good for 14 days, and that'll give you all the features you could possibly want. Once you've gotten it downloaded, it'll install, and then in SketchUp, you'll have this tool palette right here. There's only a few extra buttons here. It's very simple controls. The first thing we've got here, down at the bottom, these are the render settings, which we're going to mess with a little bit. These are all the settings you have for the render. You've got a preset resolution. The trial version will most likely be limited to a smaller size, but that's just fine. I'm going to do a slightly larger version, the full 720 version. We've got a quality slider here. Now, the higher you go, the better it's going to look, but the longer it's going to take, especially when you get up here into these really high levels, it's going to take a fairly long time, depending on how powerful your machine is. So for right now, I'm going to set it down, maybe a slightly lower setting, just to make sure that we're going to be nice and quick with it here. The scene type, you can choose either exterior or interior, depending on where you are in your model. I'm going to leave it at exterior. Update, this is a really cool feature. Single, on-demand, and auto. I'm going to set it to auto because that is really cool. You'll see what that means in just a second. We've also got some nice settings for lighting here. We've got SketchUp Sunlight, which is the default, just the lighting that you see in SketchUp. We can go with a physical sky preset, which is a bit more realistic. We can go with more presets if you have something like a meeting room or London morning, and you can set the position of the sun and everything. You can go with custom, where you can put in your own light image if you want. So you can do some really cool stuff. If you go with this one, you can choose all of these different presets. This Sunlit Lawns New Zealand one is really nice. I think I'm going to go with that. You can adjust the exposure or leave it on automatic. The background. So the background is the image that is in the background of the model. I'll show you what that means in just a second. We're going to leave these render settings for right now. The rest of these buttons, we can adjust the lights here. We can adjust the textures here. So let's say, for example, I select, using the bucket tool, I load in a sample of my siding here. I can then click this little ball right here, and this is the material editor. And it'll actually render a little sphere with the material in it, and it'll show you what it's going to look like. Now, by default, it will pick up everything itself. It'll kind of figure out what each texture needs to look like automatically, and it does a really good job of it. If you need some more fine-tuned control, you can go in on a material-by-material basis and say, okay, this is a matte finish, and you can choose whether it's a smooth matte finish or rough. You can see it update in the render there. Satin, shiny, glossy, so you can make it shinier if you want. Make it metal. Transparent, you can see transparent, you can really see what that does. That makes it like glass. You can make it thin glass or thick frosted glass, like that. Typically, you just leave it set to auto. Bump will actually affect the amount of texture that it has. If we set it really high, say 7, you can actually kind of see, it's tricky to see in this smaller version, but it will actually look at the image and figure out, based on the lighter and the darker parts of the image of the texture, how rough it needs to be and where it needs to be. So even though these textures are applied to two-dimensional faces, when it renders them in Shaderlight, it will make them more bumpy. But typically, you can just leave that set to auto. So we'll close that out. These two buttons up here, this button will render out a still image. This button will render out an animation, which you can only use if you use the built-in SketchUp animations tool. So you choose different scenes, and you animate them in SketchUp. We've talked about how to do that in a previous episode. And then you click that button, it'll render it out. That will take some time, but just be patient with it. It'll wind up looking really, really good. And then we've also got this light button here. So I'm actually going to give you a little example using a simpler project that won't take quite as long to render, so you can see what this looks like. So as far as models go, this is about as simple as you can get. It's just a simple cube. And I'm going to show you, just by default, I'm going to set my lighting to SketchUp Sunlight and turn up my resolution just a little bit here and set my quality fairly low. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Still button, Start Shaderlight Rendering. When you click that, it'll actually launch Shaderlight, which is a separate application, but it's linked with SketchUp. And you can see it starts fairly rough, and then as you wait, it gets more and more refined. And then once it's finished the render, you can look at it and you can see this is what you wind up with. As it is, you might be looking at this and thinking, well, that's not very impressive. Well, that's partially because it's just a cube, partially because it's not textured, and partially because the Shaderlight lighting settings aren't quite what they could be. I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to go into the settings, and I'm going to choose, instead of type, this is SketchUp Sunlight. This is about the most boring lighting preset you can imagine. It's even lighting across everything. There are no shadows. Different faces are slightly darker than others, but there's no realism there. So I'm going to recommend you go with something else. Physical sky is a great starting point. That'll just give you a nice, simple sky. And if we hit the render button now, we wind up with this. And this, you can see just right away, this is giving you some really interesting effects. It's actually slightly different color on each face because sunlight is a slightly warmer color, so shadows are a bit cooler, sun is a bit warmer. That's really great. If I add another element to this, say I want to create some rectangles out here just to give myself a little bit of flooring here. So I'll just like that, and I'll reverse that. Again, render it out. You can see right here, even as it's updating it, you got this shadow that it's casting right here. That's something you never see in SketchUp by default. So you've got some really good stuff there. I'm going to close this out right now, and I'm going to texture this. I'll go with a brick texture. So I'll choose brick and cladding, and I'll make this brick, and I'll make this, if we go for ground cover, maybe some vegetation here. I'll make this part grass, and I'll render that out. Now we have a photorealistic texture applied to it, so it's going to render that, and you're going to see a big difference here. So look at this render now. Now that we've got some texture applied to it, look at the realism. Look at the textures, the shadows, the roughness of the brick that it's picked up on. The lighting is just fantastic. This is really, really good. Now, you'll notice one thing that you might remember I talked about. If I switch back into SketchUp, in the settings, there's the update setting, and that's set to auto. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means if I switch back to Shaderlight and I scale this image down a little bit, scale this window down just slightly, I'll put this off to the side here, and I'll make my SketchUp project a little bit smaller so we got them side by side. Close that out. And I'll close my Textures tab as well. So now I've got my SketchUp model on the left and my render on the right. I am going to move my camera inside of SketchUp. The instant I do, it immediately starts recalculating the render. So on the fly, it is actually updating a photorealistic render of my model as I move through it. Now, it's not real time, obviously, but you don't have to keep saying, okay, new render, new render, new render. You can change something, you can model something new. Let's say, for example, as it's still going, I can have it rendering and calculating as I continue to tweak my model. Let's say I pull this part out a little bit, just do a weird thing. Instantly, it shows up here, and I've got this shadow that it's applying at the same time. This is fantastic. And of course, the faster you want it, the lower the quality is going to be. So if I set the quality down to really low, it's going to be pretty darn quick. But the result is going to be not quite what we've seen up until this point. So it's a question of striking a balance between how fast you want this to render and how good you want it to look. You can also set the resolution slightly lower when you're working on it. That'll work nicely too. So let's go back into our model now and let's see what we can do with the Kaweah Falls house. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You can see the river just kind of stops here because I can't model the whole river. So I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit right here. So I've got a nice view of the house. I can kind of see in. I'm looking across the river. This looks pretty nice right here. So I'm going to go ahead and render out a version of this. I'm going to make sure I've got my quality fairly low, just so it's not going to take forever. And going to render this out. So right away you can see it's got the water looking really good. It's gotten all the shadows of the sun shining through here. We can see into the house. It's a little bit dark, but that's okay. Now one thing you'll immediately notice is that the background is completely black. That's a little bit bland, isn't it? I'm going to go ahead and close this render. We're going to change that. Pop open the Settings tab, and you can see our background preset is set to custom. We can go with the SketchUp background, which is just going to be this really bright blue in the background. That doesn't look very real. Lighting environment, that's not going to be too good either. We'll go custom, and we'll just click this button. And again, we've got the Kaweah Falls sky image here that I've put together. That's just an image of a sky with some clouds. We can set that. And again, you're not going to see it inside of SketchUp, but you will see it in the render. So now, if I render this out, we've got this beautiful sky background now. It looks really real. So that's finishing up and looking really good. Now there's one other thing I want to talk about in regards to Shaderlight. We haven't talked about this light button right here. Now, right now what Shaderlight is doing is it's calculating sunlight, right? It's got all these different sunlight presets, the direction of the sun, you can control that. That's why we're getting all these great shadows and everything. But if we look in here, the lighting type can also be set to artificial lights only. So what does that mean? What artificial lights? We don't have artificial lights in SketchUp. Well, with Shaderlight we do. If we click this light button here, we get the light editor. And we can set up different types of lights. So we can set up a point light, which is going to be like a little ball of light. We can set up a spotlight, which will be more directional, an area light, skylight portal. We've got a lot of different settings here. And then, of course, we've also got these intensity settings. And we can choose what color we want it to be, if we want it to be a blue light or a green light or something. I'm going to go with the default here. And with this light editor open, I can just click somewhere. And when I do, you'll notice that it puts a little object in. And it just looks like a regular thing you would see in SketchUp, but it's got these special properties so that when you send something out to Shaderlight, it will basically look at this and it'll know that this is supposed to be a light. So I'm going to just set it right here. It will not render the actual object, but you can see it in SketchUp. So you know, okay, there's a light there. Kind of looks like a planet or something, like Saturn. Pull back here, and I'm going to render again. Remember, I've got artificial lights only set up. And look at that. That's pretty different, isn't it? Now that's really bright. It looks like, man, it looks like we've got a small star in there. So I think we got the intensity set a little bit too high. I'm going to select the light, and with the light editor open, I'm going to just select that light again, and I can set its intensity down. Let's try maybe 50, something fairly harmless. And we'll render it out again. There we go. That's looking a little bit better. So you can imagine with these artificial lights, you could model a real lamp in SketchUp. So you have the base and the shade and everything, and then stick one of these Shaderlight light sources inside of it. Now in SketchUp, you won't know the difference. But once you send it out to Shaderlight, you'll know the difference pretty quickly. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to set this off of artificial lights. I'm going to go back into my New Zealand lawns preset. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys what it looked like when I set this to a high quality render, as high as it could go, HD resolution, and sent it out. This is the image that I came up with. And bear in mind that the total amount of time spent in Shaderlight creating this image was probably 5 minutes or less. This is an incredibly easy tool to use, but the results it gives you are absolutely stunning. I would highly recommend you check out their website, download the trial, and see if you like it. It is a fantastic tool, and it's a great way, I think, to wrap up the Kaweah Falls house project. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this series. I've had an absolute blast, and I want to thank the Kaweah Falls house team for letting me use their house and all of their photos to help me create this model. So thank you so much to everyone who supported this series by liking it and watching it. And as always, I can remind you that you can go to our website, harwoodpodcast.com, go to the SketchUp show notes page, and you can check out all of the episodes of this series, all of the previous episodes that we've done. Check out the lesson file for this episode. You can download this model as it is right now and as it was at the beginning of the show. You can download all the textures that I used to texture all of this, and I'll have a link to Shaderlight as well, so you can check that out. And if you have any questions or comments for me about the show, you can email me directly at cameron@harwoodpodcast.com. Until next time, guys, I'll just say goodbye and good modeling.